Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first episode of Social Europe Talk. Why another talk show, you might ask yourself? Well, usually talk shows never go beyond first base. They represent two sides of the same argument, the pros and the cons. That means the discussion always gets stuck. We want to be different. Social Europe Talk is about bringing together people who agree broadly on the fundamentals, and we want to push forward new ideas and new thinking, talking about the pressing economic and social issues of our time. Today, we're going to talk about probably the most pressing issue in Europe today, which is where now for Greece and the Eurozone at large. You can comment on the program today using our hashtag #SETGreece, @SETGreece. We would like to hear what you think of our program. So first of all, let me introduce you our speakers today. To my left is James Galbraith, world-renowned economist from the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you very much for joining us. Then we have Maria Joao Rodrigues. She is a member of the European Parliament and the Vice President of the S&D Group in charge of social and economic affairs. And from Barcelona in Spain, we've got David Lizoain, who is an economist and also a member of the executive of the Socialist Party of Catalonia. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
James, may I start with you? If you can explain to our viewers, where do you think what are the fundamentals of the Greek problem? Where are we now politically, and what should be done to get over this crisis?
Well, let me put it to you this way. On January 25th, the Greek people did something quite astonishing. They had the audacity to elect a government that was prepared to take a reality-based view of the economic situation in Greece and of the catastrophic failures of the policies of the previous regime, of 6 years of policies driven by austerity, debt peonage, and a rhetoric of reform that was in fact leading to the, enormous stress, if not even the dissolution of Greek society in important ways. The government, as I say, took a reality-based view to all of that, and in so doing, it created an enormous fissure, a different point of difference of view with the irreality that dominates the discussion from the standpoint of the center of Europe, the standpoint in particular of Brussels and Berlin and Frankfurt, to a certain degree Paris. So this is what has created the situation that's been, for the last now several months, which has required a discussion, an actual discussion between one of the crisis governments, standing on its own 2 feet, whose analysis and program are different from what was previously dictated and accepted. That means that the entire European system is faced with the necessity to make adjustments. Right? And that process has been going forward. It has been a very difficult process. A major stage was reached on the 20th of February when there was an agreement in principle that the Greek government could amend the terms could actually write a new contract for reform and growth. And a further stage is being reached, I think, as we speak, as it becomes clear to the European partners, I hope, that not only do they have to give the Greek government ownership of its reform program, something that was said last night at the European Council, but they also have to be prepared to give it the financial leeway and the financial stabilization that would make it possible for the programs to work. So far, they haven't done that. That's been the major problem. And the Greek government eventually said to the European partners, if we don't address the problem of financial stability and the problem of some payments that are due in March and then in June, this isn't going to work. And at that point, it became a serious problem for the Eurozone, for the European Union, which had to be addressed at the level of heads of state.
Yeah. If you remind our readers who haven't followed the Greek situation closely, what were the main failings of the policy direction of recent years in Greece?
Well, I will just say if your readers have not been following the Greek situation closely, they should now start to follow it, because it is, I think, the opening wedge of a movement for change in Europe. Now, what were the failures of the policy? Greece has suffered a decline in its total output since 2008. That's, I think, over 25%. That's just about as serious as the United States in the worst of the Great Depression of the 1930s. It has an unemployment rate that's well over 25%. It's well over 50% for young people. But this is on a society that whose institutions were not strong to begin with, that never had, for example, a really effective tax administration or healthcare and public education and all the basics of advanced societies weren't really as strong as they have been in other parts of Europe. And so the effect of this kind of economic decline, the effect of cuts, has been to really create extreme damage to Greek society. You have homelessness, you have hunger, you have obviously major psychological effects that have affected the whole of the Greek population and then affected its economic prospects going forward. So that, in a nutshell, is where the situation is. Obviously, they were sold a bill of goods about what would work to bring them out of this. They pursued that program for a very long period of time. Now they've said, look, we have to do something different.
Maria, you've worked on these issues for the S&D Group in the European Parliament. What's your take on the situation?
Well, look, immediately after Greek elections, the S&D Group start discussing the implications of these. And this group, which is the second most important group of this Parliament, the one without which we cannot have a majority, this group was able to take a clear position. We think that the Greek people deserves a different solution. Austerity like this one is not working. This was the strong message coming from the Greek elections. But we think that we need to be precise on the alternative. Greece needs an alternative, but a credible one. So I think that the main points for this alternative is that, first of all, Greece needs to count on the proper liquidity to avoid any kind of risks of bank run or whatsoever. Then we need to make sure that Greece can have some room of maneuver to breathe regarding the pace of fiscal consolidation. Greece already has a surplus, a fiscal surplus, so the effort was huge. And we think this is not at all reasonable to go on asking Greece to make even more effort in this direction and sacrificing almost everything, growth, investments, job creation, but also the basic pillars of the welfare system. When we see that, for instance, unemployed people, they lose even the right to have access to healthcare services, we can conclude that something fundamentally wrong is taking place in Greece. So fiscal space is now crucial. But then, of course, we have all this talk about reforms. And look, our group is not against reforms, but let me make sure about what kind of reforms are needed in Greece. This is not about going on cutting wages or cutting pensions or cutting the access to welfare system. This is about to have an effective public administration able to collect taxes on a fair basis in order to provide the necessary resources for the state to operate, to invest, and to guarantee the safety net the Greek people need to have. So we need to change completely the priorities for the reform agenda regarding the past. We think that tax collection system should be at the top. Second, we should have some reforms to make sure that the welfare system is really ensuring universal coverage of the population. And then we need to have something on the support for SMEs to start growing again and creating jobs. But this is not the end of the story, because in the meantime, as you know, we are discussing in this Parliament and the European institutions an important initiative to push for investment, because there is a general investment gap in Europe. And in Greece, this is a total disaster. Investment almost disappeared. So we think that Greece should be fully involved in this European investment plan. And last but not least, our group has emphasized that we also need urgent humanitarian action. Because what is happening now in Greece is a complete humanitarian disaster. We cannot have these kind of situations in the European Union. It's completely out of our basic standards. Mm-hmm. So this is our position. You should know that we fought for this with all our actors, because our family is a bit everywhere, not only in the parliament, but in the council. Ministers of Finance, Ministers of Employment, pushing for a different solution. But we are dealing with a quite powerful family, I believe, which is the conservative one, which is resisting to this solution. Mm-hmm. And prefers to put Greece almost to the edge, close to the abyss, trying to force Greece to accept again the reform agenda of the past. Even the risk is there for a bank run. Mm-hmm. So we are completely against this kind of political strategy. We think that conservatives in Europe are playing with fire. We cannot accept this.
We come back to the resistance for policy change in a minute, but let me go first to David. How does this situation look from Spain? And in particular, Maria mentioned the humanitarian disaster. Youth unemployment, an issue that I know is also very close to your heart, is really part of this humanitarian disaster. So what do you think needs to change in this respect?
Well, I'd start off by saying that a lot of people like to make the point that Spain is not Greece. And I would start off with the opposite premise, that it's really important to bear in mind the similarities. Because this is a European problem, and it's going to require European solutions. But I think there's obviously a strong link and a sentimental link between Spain and Greece and an empathy for what's going on, because Spain, like Portugal as well, right, is another country that's been basically forced to undergo a serious adjustment, and that's generated a lot of social stress. Society is under stress. It's been tough going. And as you know, young people are bearing the brunt of this crisis. The unemployment rate for young people with a university degree is the same as the unemployment rate for people over 55 with only primary studies. So it's if the old social pact was that study and you'll have a future, that is no longer working. And so when we look at Greece, it's another country where young people are being forced to emigrate to find jobs, and that's very traumatic, because that means people that aren't able to live where they would like, and families being torn apart. In terms of the solutions, well, Spain, like Portugal, like Greece, is subject to a series of European constraints. Cannot control its own fiscal policy, as it would have once in the past. Doesn't have control over its own monetary policy. Doesn't have control over its own financial policy, because this is what happens when you've signed up to the Eurozone. So, from obviously the resistance that's begun in Greece is basically a ray of optimism, because it could potentially mark a turning point in how the European institutions are structured.
Mm-hmm. But here comes the puzzling question. We all agree that the situation in Greece is dire. You called it humanitarian disaster. James mentioned the decline in GDP. You mentioned the situation of the young people. Why? Why is this not a universally accepted analysis? Why is policy change resisted? What's your view on this, James?
Well, I'm not going to put myself into the peculiar mindset of the, let's say, the Austerian viewpoint. But it's clear what people say, and have been saying for years and years, is that the recovery is just around the corner. It
always is.
Always is just around the corner. There's a habit of economic forecasting which says that no matter how bad things are, in 6 months there will be 3% growth, and that will continue indefinitely. And if things get worse, the forecast becomes more optimistic because there's more room on the upside. So this is a mindset which you can accept for a short period of time. But after 5 years, you have to realize that it's based on a modeling strategy that doesn't apply, and on an economic policy that has been progressively making things worse rather than better. So at some point, you have to draw the opposite conclusion, that things have to change. That's the conclusion that the Greek electorate, as I say, drew on the 25th.
And some institutions, such as the IMF, at least in their research department, if not in the operational arm, have already moved away from the situation that James described, that the recovery is always around the corner. But where are the political obstacles in Europe, Maria? Why is this sort of policy change that we all agree on here? Why is this so resisted?
Because now it's difficult for some actors to recognize that this recipe was really not working and it was a failure. When you start with a program saying, well, the purpose of this program is to rebalance the budget, is to restart recovery, is to increase competitiveness, and in the end to provide conditions for growth and jobs to come back, and then you see the outcome, which is very recession, very long and deep recession, then very miserable growth coming, huge unemployment, and in the end, even in fiscal terms, the outcome is not there because the debt-GDP ratio is even higher. What is that? This is a failure. And for some actors, this is difficult to recognize this. But look, I think we have a good piece of economic theory explaining why this could be completely foreseen since the beginning. Because if you have a very sharp fiscal consolidation, combined with the credit crunch, combined with the speculative pressure on sovereign debt, all together, and without any kind of compensation on an investment program or whatsoever, it would be very easy to foresee that the outcome would be a real slump and a real jump in unemployment rate, and then forced emigration. This kind of humanitarian disaster could have been foreseen since the beginning. Now we need to reverse the trend, which means to have a completely different approach for Greece. But I agree with you. This is, from my viewpoint, the expression of a more general problem on how this Eurozone is working. Because this Eurozone now is working to create divergence, not to create convergence. If you just ask, can we say that all member states have similar conditions to invest and to create jobs? No, we don't have. If you compare the conditions for an SME to get credit in Greece or in Italy or in Finland or Germany, the conditions are completely different, which means that we need to introduce major reforms in this Eurozone. And this discussion is also very timely because Juncker, together with 3 other presidents, they have just put on the table a first document to start this general discussion. How can we complete and rebalance this economic and monetary union? Because there are many missing pieces. We are completing something called banking union to make credit flow again in normal conditions. We are still not there. The European Central Bank is playing an important role, notably now with this recent move for QE. But when we see the situation in the economic pillar of this union, we don't have coordination between surplus countries and deficit countries when it comes wages, when it comes sustaining demand. There is a problem of demand in Europe. This is not working. And then if we ask if we have the same conditions to invest, private or public investment, there is something missing, because if we are supposed to comply with the common fiscal discipline, okay, let's accept this. This is necessary for a monetary zone. This means that we should have something new called a proper fiscal capacity of the Eurozone to make these kind of things which can no longer be made by national governments. We need to have this fiscal capacity to invest and to support convergence in Europe.
Let us come back to Eurozone reform in a second. James, you wanted to say something?
I just want to come back to this point of the resistance, because my first answer was based upon a kind of vision of well-meaning error. And I don't think it's entirely restricted to that. I mean, to be honest about the situation, you do have governments in the Eurozone which feel politically vulnerable to the developments of resistance to this policy. They may get overturned in a forthcoming election. They are particularly vociferous in resisting any concessions to a change of policy or viewpoint. And secondly, you also have governments in the Eurozone which have made years of practice of treating the debtors as delinquents, is treating them as having been people who violated the rules and who deserved a certain degree of punishment. A punishment which has fallen on ordinary citizens of Greece who had no responsibility for the derelictions of their admittedly very derelict political class, which the people of Greece have just put out of power, and probably definitively. So those two things are kind of punishment mentality and a political defensiveness, combined also with a certain, let's say, orientation of policies toward grabbing assets from the debtor countries to get compensation for debts that might not be paid, a kind of debt collection mentality. All of these things play in to what has been a toxic mix of policies in the crisis countries of Europe, and especially in Greece.
David, is really the situation that we have a combination of the inability to admit past mistakes, the fear of future consequences if you did, and a certain mentality that comes all together in this mix that prevents policy change? What do you think?
Well, I think it's important to stress that there are not just losers, there are also winners over the course of these years of the austerity regime. To give it one clear example, it's not exactly the Greek state that is bailed out. It's German and French banks that no longer have any exposure. They're winners. They're winners from this policy. And therefore, German and French savers that were worried about their money, they've also won to a certain degree. Another example, when the institutions prescribe a policy of what they call internal devaluation, what they're really saying is working people should earn less so that firms can keep their profits high. So the owners of the firms are winning. The workers and the more precarious workers, younger workers, are losing. And I'd say the problem is that if we continue in this divergent tendency with some winners and some losers, the risk is that everyone will lose. There's the risk of a catastrophic breakdown of the Eurozone. There's the risk of European cohesion, and there's also the risk of democracy being undermined across the continent, because as the economic crisis intensifies, well, political crisis intensifies as well, and institutions begin to break down. So if they continue in this direction, I'd say we run the risk of things getting much worse.
There is an acute test right now of the viability of democracy in the Eurozone, which is the question of whether one can accept a government that has a fundamentally different policy view. I think that in the last few days, as that issue has become clarified, and it becomes also clear that the Greek government isn't going to back down. It has an extraordinary degree of support at home. The polls were up to 80% at the peak of the crisis in February, which means that about half of the people who voted against Syriza swung into support of the government after the elections. It's a very impressive. I mean, considering that this is a party of dissidents, activists, trade unionists, and I might add, college professors.
Not least college professors.
What an extraordinary riffraff to be in charge of a modern country and to have 80% support of your own people and to be able to declare an alternative policy and begin to work toward it in a reasonably, I mean, certainly a very striking way, a way which has caught the attention of the whole world. This is a very, very interesting development. As I say, it is a test of whether you can really have democracy as opposed to a kind of pretend back and forth between parties that offer programs that sound different but that never really get to the question of fundamental change.
But let me play devil's advocate here for 1 second. What do you make of the argument that says other governments are also elected, not just the Greek ones, and new governments should stick to treaties that previous governments actually signed? So that's an argument, for instance, that you hear a lot in Germany, where I'm from. So what would your response to this kind of argument be?
Well, the European treaties permit changes in the policy content. And that has certainly been underlined by the February 20th agreement, which was taken to the German Bundestag and passed by an overwhelming majority. So this is now an accepted point. And a communique last night from the European Council said that the Greek government would have ownership of its own reforms. It clearly clarifies the role of the institutional teams that are in Athens that are now clearly designated as fact-finding teams. These are actually very important steps, which I would take as a sign that when it really comes down to it, Europe may well not give up on democracy and may not give up on the importance of accommodating to new political and economic voices and change. So maybe I'm a little bit hopeful. I'm more hopeful than I usually am.
Well, we all want to be hopeful, Maria, but why does it always take a crisis in Europe for it to move forward? Why?
Well, because this is a very complicated machine. But I'd like to come back to your point, because this is indeed a very important point, is that we need to find a bridge between the democratic expectations of the different peoples and states composing the European Union. And by the way, this is one of the main roles of this European Parliament we are in today. Is really to have an arena where these expectations can be expressed and can be translated into an acceptable compromise, perceived as fair for everybody. Sometimes this is not easy. But I think that the fact that the Greek population has come with a clear message saying we can no longer go like that, this is a powerful message to bring this issue to the political level, to go beyond this kind of technocratic approach we were trapped in, because this is extremely political. That said, I think that the only solution for this, because we need to come back to a win-win game. We lost win-win game in Europe. And in order to come back to a win-win game, we need to be able to define a kind of new deal for Europe. Well, in my case, I'm trying to do this kind of work all the time in my own group and in the Parliament, and I came to the conclusion that we could formulate the principles for this new deal in these terms. Well, first of all, we need to ensure together that the financial system, which was behind this crisis, will be properly regulated. This is fundamental to prevent any kind of crisis of this. Second, yes, we accept to have fiscal responsibility. But then there is another thing, is that we need to have, again, growth, investment and jobs, and most of all, to move to a new kind of growth. This, which is called greener, smarter, and this means a lot of change and a lot of new investment. And then we have a final point, which is we need to make sure that all member states in the Eurozone do have opportunities to move in this direction, which is not the case now. We need to come back to a real opportunity and a real convergence in the Eurozone. And finally, last but not least, we need to make sure that the decisions about all these will be democratic. And this means an interplay with national parliaments, but also with the European Parliament. We need to reach quite quickly this new deal, because otherwise, I would like to come back to your... So far, there are winners and losers. But pay attention, please, because even the winners will become losers very soon. We are starting to have some evidence of that when we have people, young people, and not only, being forced to emigrate because they don't have jobs in their countries to other regions. These regions now, they feel they are under the risk they call social dumping. People arriving and accepting to work with lower standards. And if we go on like that, sooner or later, the welfare systems in these countries will start to be undermined. So that's why I'm saying even the winners
will be losers soon.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. David, let us come back to the fundamental point about European democracy here for a second. How can we overcome the increasing cleavage between North and South, creditors and debtors, centre and periphery? This is clearly putting a big stress to European democracy and is eroding it. What can we do to overcome this problem?
Well, I would say two things. First of all, it's necessary to have a series of, let's say, shared rules governing how the different countries will behave. But I'd say that the first thing that's happened over the course of the crisis is that a set of rules that were, let's say, previously negotiated and decided upon in a more or less democratic fashion have been replaced by a new status quo that did not come into place in a democratic way. It's sort of more of a child of blackmail, which is to say, the creation of the Troika responds to a situation where you have a country in dire financial straits, and therefore institutions that come and say, listen, either you take it or leave it. But it's not contracts that are created through imposition are not going to be generating legitimacy on the part of everyone. So the first thing is a new set of rules that actually is fruit of a give and take and a respect for these different points of view. And the second thing is that we have an incomplete monetary union. So we need to complete that monetary union. And we're seeing that we need to complete it probably with institutions that allow for, let's say, automatic transfers or automatic stabilizers. Because otherwise, when you get to a point of crisis, you get into very acrimonious discussions of who's paying for what, when really we, as Europeans, we should have rules that benefit all of us. And you have a recipe for, let's say, for more acrimony between the parts that you wouldn't have, let's say, if you're the United States, where there's a crisis in the monetary union, well, automatically the federal system transfers resources to the regions that have been the hardest hit. So it's either we complete complete the euro, or
we're going to suffer terribly in the long run.
Or in the short run.
You mentioned, or in the short run. You mentioned a new set of rules that is needed, but do we also have a set of rules that's actually constricting the things that we're doing right now? I mean, for instance, James, that's a question for you. Having fiscal policy set by rules rather than having a more flexible approach that every national government actually has. In the UK, for instance, having a debt brake would be unconstitutional because one parliament is not allowed to follow future parliaments. So is this not a senseless way of constructing fiscal policy rather than doing it a democratic way in the European Parliament and reacting to the situation? For instance, if you look at the crisis, when the financial crisis hit, nobody was talking about the 3% Maastricht deficit criteria. So you can see that when push comes to shove, these goals go out of the window first.
You know, if you read the Maastricht Treaty, it is much broader and more progressive than those 3% criteria, which were introduced into the treaty as guidelines, not as fast targets, the 3% and the 60% debt limit. The Italian government, the Italian government of Prime Minister Renzi, was motivated by a legal analysis in part to raise this question and to make it clear that it did not feel bound by the fiscal suicide pact, the fiscal compact in particular, that these were ad hoc and, in effect, extra-legal reinterpretations, post-factum reinterpretations of the treaties. So if one goes back and, again, reads the law, you will find that Europe can be reconstructed in line with its treaties in ways that would be significantly more successful than the policies that have been pursued these last 5 years. One of the disciplines that Yanis Varoufakis and Stuart Holland and I imposed on ourselves in writing what we call the modest proposal was that the four major elements of that proposal would all be within the guidelines, within the framework of existing European treaties, so that one could do a certain amount, a significant amount, certainly by time and space for Europe to deepen its union, but by changing ideas and policies rather than attempting to change the charter, which in any case would be extremely difficult to get European electorates at this point to accept. So we proposed an investment program, utilizing the capacities of the European Investment Bank and the European Investment Fund. We proposed a case-by-case resolution of insolvent banks on a European by a competent European authority. We proposed a way of lifting the burden of national debts, and this would not just be for Greece, but for any country that chose to participate. And we proposed a program of humanitarian assistance that would be a European program to begin to protect some of the most vulnerable populations, particularly with respect to food, nutrition assistance, this kind of thing. So this is something which could be done, and it's in the spirit of what the Greek Parliament tabled day before yesterday, which was the first bill not written in English, written originally in Greek in 5 years, as Alexis Tsipras said on the floor of the Greek Parliament. And what it does is it provides a food stamp type program, a nutrition assistance program for the neediest, and a program of aid to provide electrical power for people who really have been cut off from it. And so that kind of thing, which I say is entirely in the spirit of the Maastricht Treaty. We have to, when it was introduced, the existing institutions in Athens raised a question about whether this was in accord with the February 20th agreement. And I think it's been established now after the European Council that the view of Europe is that it is in accord, that it's okay. This is within the framework of what Greece considers to be the obligations that it agreed to on the 20th of February. So I guess the long point short, the getting to democratic framework is extremely important, but the existing treaties, charters, and institutions have been interpreted far more strictly in the last 5 years than is actually legally required. And so they're not as locked in or as given by law and treaty as many people believe they are.
Mm-hmm. Maria, do you agree? I mean, are the fiscal rules a guideline rather than a hard barrier?
Look, I agree with James when he says that on the short term, we need really to use the treaty frame we have to make the best interpretation we can make of this treaty frame. And there are important new things which can be made within this framework. You just mentioned that. So a good investment plan to allow ECB to play in another terms, to have a smarter strategy to reduce the debt-GDP ratio, and programs such as the Humanitarian Act. We can do all these in the framework of these treaties. So a lot depends on the way to make the interpretation for sure. Nevertheless, I can tell you that right now in the European Parliament, we are discussing this European investment plan. And we are discussing the details of a new fund to support strategic investment. And one of the key points we are discussing is, should this fund be focused on providing funding for projects using mainly the criteria of strategic impact, quality of the projects, or should this fund take into account the situation of the regions in Europe which were hit by the crisis? Can we ask this fund to play this role of cyclical
fiscal buffer,
or not? And there is a big discussion. We still don't know what will be the final decision of the Parliament about that. But in any case, imagine that the fund confines its role just to the first one I just identified. This means that giving the second kind of response to protecting with a buffer the regions which were hit by the crisis will not be performed by the fund. Which means that we'll go on with a flaw, major flaw. And that's why we need to pay attention to the ongoing discussion in another track on the way to complete and rebalance the economic and monetary union. Because we know since the beginning that this monetary zone was designed in such a way that the economic pillar and even the budgetary pillar are indeed very weak when compared with the monetary pillar. So I really think that sooner or later we'll be confronted with the issue of building up a fiscal capacity for the Eurozone.
David, can the investment plan that is currently being discussed and tabled, even though it has several layers of leverage that some people might find a bit dubious, could it be the origin of a fiscal capacity for the Eurozone that can sort of fulfill the function in the long run that you talked about as buffering asymmetric shocks?
Well, it could be the embryo. We don't know what the embryo will grow into. Will it be a monkey? Will it be a human?
But do you see that the embryo is actually growing, or is it unlikely to do much in the future?
I'd say it depends on the work our colleagues are able to do here in the European Parliament to make sure it has more of a progressive bent and therefore is more ambitious, rather than trying to be, I'd say, basically just a fig leaf to suggest that something is happening, as opposed to...
the risk is there.
And it, of course, has to be doubled up by national investment strategies. So you cannot do just from Brussels. So it has to be a joint effort to try to get Europe out of the economic stagnation that we have been in for
But that's why this discussion we now have about the flexibility of the fiscal rules is also important, because we managed to get from this Commission some room of maneuver to invest if member states are below 3% of deficit. But for those member states who are still not there, they cannot have this kind of golden rule for investment. So there is something missing here. And by the way, we are now discussing about what kinds of fiscal capacity, and we can identify three possibilities which are not excluding each other. One would be a kind of economic buffer to work as a counter-cyclical mechanism. If there is in the downside of the cycle. The other one would be to have a kind of social buffer, a kind of European unemployment insurance complementing the national ones. We are also discussing about having a new kind of convergence fund to support investments combined with the right reforms in the regions and countries which are under stress.
Mm-hmm. James, you want to come in?
A couple of things. I'm not all that close, and certainly not as close as Maria is, to the specific discussion of the Juncker plan and its successors.
This is our task here.
But there are 2 points that I think bear making on investment funding and the type of investment. On funding, it would be possible to use the quantitative easing of the European Central Bank to support a greatly expanded European Investment Bank program. They just support the prices of the EIB's bonds to maintain its AAA rating and put that paper in the European Central Bank's portfolio, solving the problem of buying directly government bonds. And this is, I think, perfectly plausible thing to do, which should be on the agenda for a greatly expanded and much more direct and effective way of getting the investment in. Secondly, on the question of the type of investment, and this is something that comes out of American experience in part with the ARRA, with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. It's very important to consider investments that do, in fact, bring jobs and bring them on a sustainable basis. And so investments in not just physical infrastructure, not just roads and bridges, of which I'm afraid to say Portugal has
we need to shift to
got a lot, but investment in healthcare facilities, in educational facilities, in social and cultural facilities of various types, in environmental protection, in archaeological protection and work. All of this kind of thing, which would create an ongoing stream of employment opportunities.
Yeah, this is very important.
Very
we are
important,
just working
very
on this
important
now.
to do. Yep.
So good things are in the pipeline. Our time is already almost up. So I give 20 seconds or 30 seconds to each. If we met again in 6 months' time, what would you like to have seen happen in the meantime? Maria, I start with you.
Well, I'd like to see a turning point for Europe to understand that when we are confronted with so many difficult situations in the external borders, Ukraine, Libya, many new problems are around us. This is not the time for us to be divided with such tiny things. We need to get back to a cohesion and convergence and a win-win game.
David, we're going to be in 6 months' time.
Well, I hope that in a Spanish perspective, we're on the verge of getting rid of Mariano Rajoy and his, let's say, corrupt anti-social government. Let's say the top priority at the Spanish level.
Okay. James?
David stole my thunder was exactly what I was going to say.
It's hard to top that, isn't it?
I was going to be slightly more generous. I just think that we should have a rise of hope in the Iberian Peninsula, the spirit of perhaps yes we can coming that was spreading from all across the south of Europe as a result of the changes that are already underway.
Okay, thank you very much, all of you, and thank you very much for watching our first Social Europe talk. You can comment on this program by using our hashtag #SETGreece, #SetGreece, and we're looking forward to your comments, and hopefully you can watch us again in the future. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm not sure where it is, left, right, center, bottom, down, but I hope to see you in the future. Thank you and bye-bye.